The year was 1914. For thousands of believers across America and beyond, this wasn't just another year on the calendar. It was the year. The culmination of decades of calculations, biblical exegesis, and prophetic anticipation. According to Charles Taze Russell, the charismatic founder of what would eventually become known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, 1914 would mark nothing less than the end of one age and the spectacular beginning of another. This was to be the year when God's kingdom would descend upon earth, when the Gentile nations would crumble into dust, when Christ would establish his visible reign over all humanity, when the faithful would be transformed, glorified, and lifted into their eternal reward. Thousands of Russell's followers had arranged their entire lives around this date. Some had sold their homes and businesses. Others had abandoned careers and education. Many had severed ties with family members who refused to believe. They gathered in meeting halls and private homes, watching the calendar with trembling anticipation, waiting for the signs that would herald the end of the world as they knew it. But when the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1914, something unexpected happened. Nothing. The governments of the world, battered though they were by the outbreak of the Great War, remained standing. Christ did not appear in the clouds. The faithful were not transformed into glorified beings. The Gentile times, supposedly ended, seemed to continue without interruption. And the kingdom of God, so confidently predicted to be visible, literal, and unmistakable, was nowhere to be seen. What happened next would become one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in modern religious history. Because Charles Taze Russell didn't simply admit he was wrong and walk away. Instead, he did something far more complex, far more subtle, and far more consequential for the millions who would follow in his footsteps. He rewrote the narrative. Today, you're going to discover the 3 specific prophecies that Russell made about 1914, each one a pillar of his theological system, each one a promise to his followers. You'll learn exactly how each prophecy failed. And most importantly, you'll uncover what Russell did in the shadows, away from public scrutiny, when he realized that nothing had happened as he had so confidently proclaimed. This is the story of failed prophecy, cognitive dissonance, and the remarkable human capacity to reshape reality when confronted with inconvenient truth. The rise of Charles Taze Russell. To understand the magnitude of the 1914 failure, we must first understand the man behind the predictions. Charles Taze Russell was born in 1852 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into a family of Scottish-Irish Presbyterians. His early life was marked by comfortable middle-class circumstances. His father owned a successful chain of clothing stores, but also by deep religious questioning. As a teenager, Russell experienced a crisis of faith, troubled by the doctrine of eternal hellfire that dominated mainstream Christianity of his era. This theological discomfort would set him on a path that would consume the rest of his life. Russell began studying the Bible independently, convinced that traditional church teachings had strayed far from biblical truth. By his early 20s, he had gathered a small group of like-minded Bible students who met regularly to study Scripture and challenge conventional interpretations. What set Russell apart wasn't just his theological conclusions, it was his absolute confidence in them. Here was a man with no formal theological training who nonetheless believed he had unlocked secrets that had eluded scholars and clergy for centuries. And crucially, he believed these secrets revealed a timeline, a divine schedule that could be calculated, understood, and predicted. In 1879, Russell began publishing Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, a magazine that would become the primary vehicle for spreading his teachings. His writing style was accessible, his arguments seemed logical, and his confidence was infectious. More importantly, he offered something that many Christians desperately wanted: certainty. In an age of rapid industrialization, social upheaval, and theological controversy, Russell provided clear answers and a definite timeline. By the 1880s and 1890s, Russell had developed an elaborate chronology based on his interpretation of biblical prophecy, particularly the books of Daniel and Revelation. This chronology became the backbone of his theological system, and its centerpiece was a specific date: 1914. Russell's movement grew steadily. His publications reached hundreds of thousands of readers. His speaking tours drew large crowds. His multi-volume series Studies in the Scriptures became bestsellers, with Russell claiming they were more valuable for understanding the Bible than reading the Bible itself, a statement that raised eyebrows among critics but was embraced by devoted followers. The closer 1914 came, the more specific and emphatic Russell's predictions became. This wasn't vague apocalyptic speculation. Russell was making concrete, testable claims about what would happen in a specific year. His followers weren't just hoping for divine intervention, they were expecting it, based on calculations they believed were mathematically sound and biblically grounded. And then 1914 arrived. Prophecy number 1. The end of human governments. The first and perhaps most fundamental of Russell's prophecies concerned what he called the times of the Gentiles. Drawing from a complex interpretation of Daniel 4 and Luke 21 verse 24, Russell developed a chronological system that counted 2,520 years from the supposed fall of Jerusalem in 607 BCE to arrive at 1914 CE. This wasn't arbitrary mathematics. Russell constructed an elaborate theological framework around 7 times of Gentile domination, with each time representing 360 years. According to Russell's teaching, these Gentile times represented a period during which God had permitted human governments to rule the earth without direct divine intervention. But in 1914, this permission would expire. The lease, so to speak, would run out. What did Russell expect to happen? In his own words, written in Studies in the Scriptures and various Watchtower publications, Russell predicted the full end of the kingdoms of this world in 1914. He taught that human governments would collapse, giving way to God's kingdom. He didn't mean this metaphorically or spiritually, he meant the literal end of earthly political systems. Russell's followers understood this clearly. They expected kings to fall, governments to dissolve, and the political order of the world to disintegrate. Some even anticipated that they might need to flee to remote locations to escape the chaos. The message was unambiguous. Human government was on borrowed time, and that time would expire in 1914. Then came August 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that plunged Europe into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. The Great War, later known as World War I, erupted with shocking violence. Empires did clash. Millions would die. The old order of European politics would indeed be shaken to its foundations. For a brief moment, some of Russell's followers felt vindicated. Wasn't this the collapse of governments they had predicted? Wasn't this the chaos that would precede God's kingdom? But as the months passed, a troubling reality became clear. The governments hadn't ended. They had gone to war. Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary. All the great powers were still firmly in control of their territories, mobilizing millions of soldiers, and fighting with industrial efficiency. If anything, governments had become more powerful and more intrusive in citizens' lives, not less. The kingdoms of this world had not ended. Christ had not begun to reign. The political order had changed, yes, but it had not been replaced by God's kingdom. The Gentile times, supposedly concluded, seemed to march on with brutal intensity. This presented Russell with an enormous problem. His followers had not merely hoped for this outcome, they had been promised it. Many had organized their entire lives around this expectation. Some had made significant financial sacrifices. Others had endured ridicule from family and friends who dismissed Russell's predictions as foolishness. And now, those skeptics seemed to have been proven right. Russell's initial response was to double down on the significance of 1914, arguing that the outbreak of war itself was a fulfillment of prophecy. The war, he suggested, was the beginning of the time of trouble that would lead to the establishment of God's kingdom. The end hadn't come exactly as expected, but it had begun. This was the first subtle shift, from "the end will happen in 1914" to "the beginning of the end happened in 1914." It was a small change in language, but it represented an enormous change in meaning. The goalposts, whether Russell fully realized it or not, had begun to move. Yet even as he made this adjustment, the fundamental problem remained. The prophecy about the end of human governments in 1914 had failed. The kingdoms of this world had not given way to the kingdom of God. And no amount of reinterpretation could change that basic fact. Prophecy number 2. The visible kingdom of Christ. Russell's second major prophecy was intimately connected to the first. He taught that 1914 would mark the beginning of Christ's visible, literal reign on earth. This wasn't a prophecy about some distant, spiritual reality. Russell explicitly taught that God's kingdom would be established on earth in a tangible, observable way. Christ would begin to reign, and this reign would be evident to all humanity. The kingdom wouldn't be a matter of faith or interpretation, it would be an undeniable reality. In Studies in the Scriptures, Russell wrote extensively about this coming kingdom. He described how the faithful would be part of this government, how society would be reorganized according to divine principles, and how the earth would be transformed into a paradise. This was the blessed hope that motivated his followers. They weren't just going to watch the kingdom arrive, they were going to be part of it. Russell's teachings created vivid expectations. His followers anticipated seeing Christ's authority manifested in world events. They expected the structures of human society to be visibly replaced by divine government. Some even prepared to take up administrative roles in this new order, believing they had been chosen for specific positions in the coming kingdom. But as 1914 unfolded, no visible kingdom appeared. Christ did not begin reigning in any observable sense. The structures of human government, though shaken by war, remained intact. The promised transformation of earth into paradise did not occur. For all practical purposes, the world looked much as it had before, only now it was bloodier and more chaotic. This created an existential crisis for Russell and his movement. Unlike the first prophecy, which could potentially be massaged into a beginning of the end interpretation, this prophecy was harder to spin. Either the kingdom was visible or it wasn't. Either Christ was reigning in an observable way or he wasn't. What Russell did next was both brilliant and controversial. He shifted the goalposts again, this time more dramatically. He began to teach that the kingdom had indeed been established in 1914, but invisibly, in heaven. Christ had begun to reign, but not on earth. The kingdom existed, but in a spiritual realm that couldn't be directly observed. The prophecy hadn't failed. Rather, everyone had misunderstood how it would be fulfilled. This reinterpretation was a masterpiece of theological maneuvering. It allowed Russell to maintain that he had been right about the date while adjusting what the date actually meant. The kingdom had come, just not in the way anyone expected. Christ was reigning, just not where anyone could see. For some followers, this explanation was sufficient. After all, Russell had been right about something happening in 1914. The outbreak of the Great War seemed too coincidental to ignore. Perhaps they had simply misunderstood the nature of what would occur. Perhaps spiritual fulfillment was more important than physical manifestation. But for others, this felt like moving the goalposts. They had been promised a visible kingdom, and now they were being told it was invisible. They had expected to see Christ's reign, and now they were being asked to accept it on faith alone. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Russell handled this delicate situation with careful language. In his publications, he began emphasizing that he had always understood the kingdom would have both heavenly and earthly aspects. He cited earlier writings that mentioned heavenly phases of the kingdom, conveniently omitting the many statements where he had explicitly predicted visible, earthly manifestations in 1914. This invisible kingdom doctrine would become central to the theology of Russell's successors. It solved the problem of failed prophecy by making the fulfillment unfalsifiable. If the kingdom was invisible, who could prove it hadn't come? At the same time, it created new problems, as critics and disappointed followers asked the obvious question: what's the difference between an invisible kingdom and no kingdom at all? The shift from visible to invisible kingdom was more than just a theological adjustment. It was a fundamental change in the nature of religious certainty. Russell had built his movement on the promise of empirical fulfillment. You would see the kingdom come. But when that empirical fulfillment didn't materialize, the movement was forced to retreat into unfalsifiable spiritual claims. This pattern, making specific, testable predictions and then reinterpreting them as spiritual or invisible fulfillments when they fail, would become a recurring feature of the religious movement Russell founded. The 1914 experience established a template that would be repeated with other dates: 1918, 1925, 1975, and beyond. Prophecy number 3. The transformation of the saints. The third major prophecy Russell made about 1914 concerned the fate of his faithful followers, specifically those he called the anointed, or saints. Russell taught that there was a special class of Christians, limited to exactly 144,000 individuals, based on his interpretation of Revelation, who would be chosen to reign with Christ in heaven. These were the little flock, the truly faithful believers who had been called to a heavenly destiny. And according to Russell's chronology, their transformation was imminent. Around 1914, these faithful believers would be glorified. They would be changed from mortal to immortal, from earthly to heavenly. Some would die and be instantly resurrected to heaven. Others might be translated directly, like Enoch in the Old Testament, without experiencing death at all. This wasn't a vague promise about the afterlife. Russell taught that this transformation would occur around 1914 as part of the inauguration of God's kingdom. The anointed would be taken to their heavenly reward, where they would begin their work as co-rulers with Christ. For many of Russell's followers, this was the most personal and exciting of all his prophecies. Unlike the fall of governments or the establishment of an invisible kingdom, this prophecy affected them directly. They expected to be transformed, glorified, caught up to heaven. This wasn't about watching prophecy unfold, it was about experiencing it firsthand. Some of Russell's followers made dramatic life decisions based on this expectation. Why pursue education when you'll be in heaven soon? Why save for retirement when the current system is about to end? Why worry about long-term plans when glorification is just around the corner? As 1914 progressed, these faithful believers waited for their transformation. They watched for signs. They prepared themselves spiritually. They wondered if they would be among those chosen for heavenly glory. But month after month passed, and no transformation occurred. The faithful remained stubbornly earthbound. No one was glorified. No one was caught up to heaven. No one experienced the promised change from mortality to immortality. By the end of 1914, this uncomfortable reality could no longer be ignored. The transformation hadn't happened. The saints were still mortal. The anointed were still on earth. The rapture, or translation, or glorification, whatever term one used, had not occurred. This failure was perhaps the most personally devastating for Russell's followers. They could rationalize the invisible kingdom. They could accept new interpretations of the times of the Gentiles. But they couldn't ignore the fact that they were still here, still mortal, still waiting. Russell's response to this failure was more subdued than his handling of the other failed prophecies. In his final 2 years of life, he died in October 1916, he began to quietly acknowledge in internal publications that we might have misunderstood the exact manner in which the prophecies would be fulfilled. This was as close as Russell ever came to admitting error. He didn't use the word wrong. He didn't say the prophecy had failed. Instead, he suggested that perhaps the timing was right, but the understanding of how it would happen was imperfect. Maybe the transformation would be gradual rather than sudden. Maybe it would occur over a period of years rather than at a specific moment. These were subtle adjustments, mentioned almost in passing in the pages of the Watchtower. For casual readers, they might have seemed like minor theological clarifications. But for those who had been paying close attention, they represented a quiet retreat from specific predictions. The transformation prophecy's failure highlighted a fundamental problem with date setting. When you make concrete predictions about specific events happening at specific times to specific people, failure becomes undeniable. Russell could spiritualize the kingdom and reinterpret the end of Gentile times, but he couldn't explain away the fact that his anointed followers were still mortal in 1915, 1916, and beyond. In later years, Russell's successors would develop elaborate explanations for why the transformation hadn't occurred as expected. They would teach that the anointed were still being gathered, that the full number of 144,000 hadn't yet been reached, that the transformation would occur at Armageddon rather than at the beginning of Christ's reign. But none of these later explanations could erase the original expectation or the original failure. Russell had taught that something specific would happen to specific people at a specific time, and it simply hadn't occurred. When three major prophecies fail simultaneously, most religious leaders face a critical choice: admit error and lose credibility, or find a way to reframe the failure as success. Russell chose a third path, one that was more subtle and ultimately more consequential. He began to quietly reconstruct the narrative, not through dramatic announcements or theological manifestos, but through hundreds of small adjustments in his teachings, publications, and private communications. This reconstruction happened largely away from public scrutiny. While Russell continued his public ministry, traveling, speaking, publishing, he simultaneously worked behind the scenes to reshape the meaning of 1914 and prepare his followers for a longer wait than they had anticipated. In his personal correspondence with close associates, Russell acknowledged the disappointment many felt. He counseled patience and faith. He suggested that perhaps their expectations had been too materialistic, too focused on earthly manifestations rather than spiritual realities. He reminded them that God's ways are higher than human ways, and that apparent delays in his plan didn't constitute failures. In the pages of the Watchtower, Russell began introducing new interpretations without explicitly acknowledging that they contradicted earlier teachings. He would cite his previous articles selectively, highlighting statements that could be read as consistent with the new understanding while ignoring passages that contradicted it. One of Russell's key strategies was to shift emphasis from what will happen to what has happened. Instead of looking forward to future fulfillments, he encouraged followers to look back at 1914 and recognize the prophetic significance of events that had already occurred. The outbreak of World War I became retrospectively significant in a way that it hadn't seemed at the time. Russell also began to prepare his followers for the possibility of a prolonged period of waiting. He introduced teaching about overlapping generations and extended timelines. He suggested that while 1914 marked a crucial turning point, the full manifestation of God's kingdom might take longer than initially thought. Most significantly, Russell began to discourage speculation about new dates. Having been burned by the 1914 experience, he counseled his followers to focus on spiritual readiness rather than calendar calculations. This was a dramatic reversal for a man whose entire movement had been built on precise chronological predictions. In his final series of publications, Russell continued to defend 1914 as a pivotal year while quietly downplaying the specific predictions he had made about it. He maintained that the times of the Gentiles had indeed ended in 1914, that Christ's kingdom had indeed begun, invisibly, and that the faithful had not been wrong to expect great things. What Russell never did, however, was explicitly admit that his specific predictions had failed. He never said, "I was wrong about the visible kingdom," or "I miscalculated the timing of the transformation of the saints." Instead, he positioned the failures as misunderstandings on the part of followers who had been too literal-minded or too eager. This approach, acknowledging that expectations weren't met while avoiding direct admission of error, would become a template for how his successors would handle subsequent failed predictions. It allowed the movement to maintain continuity and credibility while adjusting its teachings to accommodate inconvenient realities. Russell's reconstruction of the 1914 narrative was also aided by external events. The horrific carnage of World War I, which killed millions and traumatized an entire generation, seemed to validate at least part of Russell's apocalyptic worldview. Even if the specific prophecies had failed, something momentous had clearly happened in 1914. The world had indeed changed, even if it hadn't changed in the way Russell predicted. In his private moments, and we know this from letters and diary entries of close associates, Russell expressed both confidence and confusion. He remained convinced that he had correctly identified 1914 as significant, but he seemed less certain about exactly what that significance was. He died in 1916, still believing that he had been fundamentally right even if specific details required adjustment. The question remains, was Russell consciously deceiving his followers, or was he deceiving himself as well? The evidence suggests the latter. By all accounts, Russell genuinely believed his own teachings. When they failed, he experienced the same cognitive dissonance as his followers. His secret work of reconstruction wasn't a cynical manipulation. It was a desperate attempt to salvage meaning from what must have felt like theological chaos. Russell's death in October 1916 left his movement at a crossroads. The 1914 predictions had failed, the founder was gone, and thousands of followers were left trying to make sense of what had happened, or hadn't happened. Joseph Franklin Rutherford, who would succeed Russell as president of the Watchtower Society, inherited this complicated legacy. Rutherford faced a difficult choice: acknowledge that Russell had been wrong, or find a way to maintain continuity with Russell's teachings while addressing the obvious failures. Rutherford chose continuity, but with significant modifications. Under his leadership, the movement would become more authoritarian, more doctrinally rigid, and ironically, more prone to setting new dates, despite Russell's late-in-life warnings against this practice. Rutherford promoted the invisible kingdom interpretation more forcefully than Russell ever had. He developed elaborate explanations for why various prophecies had been fulfilled spiritually rather than physically. And crucially, he presented these reinterpretations not as corrections but as progressive revelation, new light from God that helped clarify what had always been true. In 1918, Rutherford predicted that ancient Hebrew prophets would be resurrected and appear in Jerusalem. When this didn't happen, he adjusted the timeline. In 1920, he published a book titled Millions Now Living Will Never Die, which heavily promoted 1925 as a year of prophetic significance. When 1925 came and went without the predicted events, the movement experienced another crisis of faith. The pattern established by the 1914 failure repeated itself. Specific prediction, followed by failure, followed by reinterpretation and adjustment. Each cycle eroded credibility with some followers, while paradoxically strengthening the faith of others who saw the very act of adjustment as evidence of humility and progressive understanding. By the 1930s, the movement that Russell had founded had transformed in significant ways. It had adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses, a name Russell never used. It had become more centrally controlled and less tolerant of independent Bible study. And it had developed a sophisticated apparatus for managing failed predictions through reinterpretation and revision. The 1914 date itself underwent further transformation. While originally predicted as the year of visible, literal fulfillment, it became in official Jehovah's Witness theology the year when Christ's invisible kingdom began in heaven. This invisible enthronement became the foundation for subsequent calculations, including the prediction that the generation alive in 1914 would not pass away before Armageddon came. This generation of 1914 teaching would itself eventually fail when that generation did pass away, leading to yet another round of reinterpretation in the 1990s and 2000s. But that's a story for another time. The 1914 case offers a fascinating window into how human beings respond to cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that occurs when reality contradicts deeply held beliefs. Social psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively, most famously in Leon Festinger's classic work, When Prophecy Fails, which documented a UFO cult whose predicted apocalypse didn't occur. Festinger observed that rather than abandoning their beliefs when faced with disconfirmation, many cult members actually became more convinced and more evangelistic. This seeming paradox makes sense when we understand the psychological dynamics at play. When people have invested heavily in a belief, emotionally, socially, financially, abandoning that belief becomes psychologically costly. It's not just about admitting you were wrong. It's about acknowledging that your investment was wasted, that your sacrifices were foolish, that your life choices were misguided. In such situations, reinterpretation becomes psychologically attractive. If you can find a way to maintain that your core belief was correct while adjusting peripheral details, you can preserve your identity and justify your investment. This is precisely what happened with Russell's followers after 1914. For many of them, abandoning their faith would have meant admitting that years or decades of their lives had been misdirected. It would have meant acknowledging that they had sacrificed relationships, opportunities, and resources for nothing. The psychological cost was simply too high. Reinterpretation offered a middle path. By accepting that the kingdom had come invisibly, or that the end had begun even if it hadn't been completed, followers could maintain their core identity and belief system while acknowledging that superficial expectations had been wrong. This psychological dynamic helps explain why failed prophecies often don't destroy religious movements. Instead, they can actually strengthen them by creating a shared experience of crisis and resolution. Those who stay through a prophetic failure often emerge with deeper commitment, having passed through fire together. There's also the sunk cost fallacy at play. The more you've invested in something, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when evidence suggests you should. Russell's followers in 1914 had invested not just money but their entire worldview. Walking away would have meant starting over from scratch, a daunting prospect for anyone, but especially for those who had shaped their entire identity around these beliefs. Additionally, the social dimension cannot be underestimated. These weren't isolated individuals believing in private, they were members of a community. Leaving the movement meant losing friendships, social support, and a sense of belonging. For many, staying and accepting reinterpretations was socially easier than leaving and facing isolation. What can we learn from the story of Russell's failed 1914 prophecies? Several lessons emerge, relevant not just to religious studies but to broader questions about belief, certainty, and human psychology. First, beware of absolute certainty, especially about future events. Russell's confidence in his predictions was complete. He didn't speak in probabilities or possibilities. He declared certainties. This left no room for nuance when the predictions failed. A more humble epistemic stance, "we believe this is likely," rather than "this will definitely happen," provides psychological flexibility when reality doesn't cooperate. Second, recognize the danger of organizing your life around unprovable predictions. Many of Russell's followers made irreversible decisions based on the certainty that 1914 would bring the end. They sold property, abandoned careers, and damaged relationships. When the predictions failed, they couldn't simply rewind their lives. The practical consequences of misplaced certainty can be devastating. Third, understand how cognitive dissonance drives reinterpretation. When faced with failed predictions, the human mind instinctively seeks ways to preserve core beliefs while acknowledging surface contradictions. This isn't necessarily dishonest. It's a natural psychological process. But recognizing this tendency can help us be more critical of our own rationalizations when our beliefs encounter contradictory evidence. Fourth, note how institutional structures can entrench error. Russell's organization had become an institution by 1914, with publishing houses, speaking tours, and administrative structures. These institutions had their own momentum and their own interest in survival. Even if individual leaders recognized problems with the predictions, the institutional apparatus provided incentives to reinterpret rather than admit failure and dissolve. Fifth, observe how selective memory reshapes narratives. In later decades, official Jehovah's Witness publications would describe the 1,914 predictions in ways that minimized or ignored the specific failures. Statements that clearly predicted visible fulfillment were forgotten or recontextualized. This wasn't necessarily intentional deception. Human memory is naturally selective, and institutions remember what serves them. Finally, recognize the power of community in maintaining beliefs despite contradictory evidence. Beliefs don't exist in isolation. They're embedded in social networks. When a community collectively accepts a reinterpretation, individual doubt becomes harder to maintain. The social pressure to conform, to remain part of the group, can override rational evaluation of evidence. The legacy of 1914. More than a century after Russell's failed predictions, the year 1914 remains central to Jehovah's Witness theology. But it means something entirely different now than it did to Russell's original followers. Today's Jehovah's Witnesses teach that 1914 marked the invisible beginning of Christ's kingdom in heaven, the end of the Gentile times, and the start of the last days. They point to World War I as evidence that something significant happened that year. They see the 20th century's wars, famines, and earthquakes as fulfillment of prophecies about the end times. What they typically don't know, and what the organization's literature doesn't emphasize, is the extent to which the original 1914 predictions failed. They don't know that Russell explicitly predicted visible, literal fulfillments that never materialized. They don't know about the crisis of faith that followed. They don't know about the quiet reconstruction of the narrative that occurred in Russell's final years. This historical amnesia isn't unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. Many religious movements sanitize their histories, emphasizing successes and downplaying or ignoring embarrassments. But it does highlight an important point. The 1914 that Jehovah's Witnesses believe in today is a construct built on the ruins of Russell's failed predictions. The legacy of 1914 is thus double-edged. On one hand, it represents a failure of prophetic prediction and a case study in cognitive dissonance and narrative reconstruction. On the other hand, it demonstrates the remarkable resilience of religious belief and the human capacity to find meaning even in disappointment. For critics of Jehovah's Witnesses, 1914 represents everything wrong with date-setting and failed prophecy. For believing Jehovah's Witnesses, it represents a crucial turning point in human history, misunderstood by the world but recognized by the faithful. The truth, as is often the case, is more complex than either simple narrative allows. The story of Charles Taze Russell's failed 1914 prophecies is ultimately a human story, a tale of hope and disappointment, certainty and confusion, faith and doubt. Russell was not a cynical charlatan deliberately deceiving gullible followers. By all accounts, he genuinely believed his own teachings. He invested his life in spreading what he considered vital truth. When his predictions failed, he experienced real confusion and struggled to understand what had gone wrong. His followers were not fools. They were people seeking meaning, certainty, and hope in an uncertain world. Russell offered them all three. The fact that his promises didn't materialize as expected doesn't make their faith foolish, it makes them human. The three prophecies that failed, the end of human governments, the visible kingdom of Christ, and the transformation of the saints, were specific, testable predictions. When they failed, honest acknowledgement would have been the most straightforward response. But honesty about failure is psychologically costly, especially when you've built your entire life around certain expectations. What Russell did in the aftermath, the quiet reconstruction of the narrative, the subtle shifts in emphasis, the reluctant acknowledgement of misunderstanding rather than error, wasn't exceptional. It's what humans do when confronted with cognitive dissonance. We rationalize. We reinterpret. We find ways to preserve our core identity while adjusting peripheral beliefs. The real question isn't whether Russell was right or wrong about 1914. The evidence is clear that his specific predictions failed. The real question is what this case teaches us about the nature of religious certainty, the psychology of belief, and our human tendency to prefer comfortable reinterpretation over uncomfortable truth. Russell died in 1916, still convinced that he had been fundamentally correct about 1914, even if details required adjustment. His followers continued his work, building a worldwide movement that would eventually number in the millions. The predictions failed, but the faith survived, rebuilt, reinterpreted, but recognizably descended from Russell's original vision. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from the 1914 story. Human beings are remarkably resilient in maintaining belief despite contradictory evidence. We are meaning-making creatures, and when our narratives encounter obstacles, we find ways to reconstruct them rather than abandon them entirely. The three prophecies of 1914 failed, but the myth survived, rebuilt piece by piece until it became the doctrine millions believe today. And Charles Taze Russell's secret work of reconstruction, carried out in the pages of obscure publications and personal letters, shaped not just the aftermath of one prophetic failure, but the entire trajectory of a religious movement that continues to this day. In the end, the story of 1914 is a reminder that certainty is often an illusion, that predictions are perilous, and that when humans are forced to choose between admitting error and reconstructing their understanding of reality, they will almost always choose reconstruction. The world didn't end in 1914. But for thousands of Russell's followers, a world did end, the world of certainty they had been promised. What they built in its place was different from what they expected, but it was theirs. And for many, that was enough.